For years, one name quietly influenced how millions of people around the world experience video games, without ever demanding constant attention or personal recognition. Long before headlines appeared, that influence was already embedded into the mechanics, pacing, and design philosophy of some of the most recognizable titles in modern gaming. Today, that same name is being discussed for very different reasons, and the full story is still unfolding. According to early and publicly available reports, Vince Zampella, widely known as a co-creator of the Call of Duty franchise, has been linked to recent news that remains under official review. At this time, many of the key details have not been fully confirmed, and authorities have indicated that information is still being gathered. This has naturally led to a mix of uncertainty, reflection, and cautious discussion across the gaming community. What makes this moment particularly notable is not only the report itself, but the scale of Zampella's long-standing impact. For more than 2 decades, his work helped shape how large-scale games are developed, how players connect online, and how studios think about long-term engagement. Yet despite this influence, he rarely positioned himself as the public face of his creations. That contrast matters, because when someone who helped define an entire era of entertainment suddenly becomes the focus of developing news, the instinct is often to rush toward conclusions. But in situations like this, context becomes essential. Understanding why this story resonates so deeply requires stepping back and examining the broader picture rather than focusing on a single moment. Zampella's career is often described not in terms of individual success, but in terms of systems and foundations. From early design decisions to studio leadership, his approach emphasized longevity, adaptability, and player-centered experiences. Many of the design principles now considered standard across the industry can be traced back to teams and projects he helped guide. And this is where the curiosity truly begins. Because while reports continue to evolve, the conversation surrounding Vince Zampella has already expanded beyond news updates. Developers, analysts, and longtime players are revisiting his contributions, not out of controversy, but out of recognition of how deeply his work is woven into modern gaming culture. Right now, there is a clear distinction between what is known and what remains uncertain. Official statements have acknowledged his influence and expressed sympathy for those affected, while investigators have emphasized that conclusions should not be drawn prematurely. This balance between acknowledgement and caution is important, especially in an environment where information travels faster than verification. So before any assumptions are made, one question stands out. How did someone who preferred to operate behind the scenes end up shaping so much of what players take for granted today? And why does this moment prompt such widespread reflection across an industry built on constant change? Because to understand why this story matters, you first have to understand what Vince Zampella represented long before the headlines, and how his legacy was already influencing the future of games. Long before recent reports surfaced, Vince Zampella's name was already associated with a very specific kind of influence, one that rarely relied on public visibility. His career followed a pattern that industry observers often describe as quietly transformative. Instead of chasing trends, his teams consistently focused on systems that could scale, evolve, and remain relevant for years. Publicly available information shows that when Call of Duty launched in the early 2000s, it arrived at a moment when first-person shooters were still finding their footing on consoles. The series didn't just succeed commercially. It normalized ideas that would later become standard, such as tightly structured multiplayer progression, cinematic pacing, and a release model that encouraged long-term player engagement. What's often overlooked is that many of these ideas were not obvious at the time. They required confidence in player behavior, trust in iteration, and a willingness to rethink how large teams collaborate. People who worked alongside Zampella have frequently described him as someone who focused less on individual features and more on how all parts of a game fit together over time. After Infinity Ward, that same philosophy carried forward into Respawn Entertainment. Titles like Titanfall and later Apex Legends weren't just new intellectual properties. They were experiments in movement, accessibility, and competitive balance. According to industry analysts, Apex Legends in particular demonstrated that large-scale multiplayer games could launch successfully without relying on traditional release models, influencing how publishers approach free-to-play ecosystems today. This matters because it explains why reactions to recent news have been measured, reflective, and centered on legacy rather than speculation. While details surrounding the reported incident remain under investigation, much of the public conversation has focused on Zampella's long-term contributions rather than the uncertainty of the present moment. Electronic Arts' statement, shared through media outlets, emphasized his role as a leader and visionary whose work inspired millions of players and developers worldwide. That language wasn't accidental. It reflects how he was perceived internally, as someone who shaped teams, encouraged experimentation, and supported creative risk within structured boundaries. At the same time, authorities have made it clear that the situation surrounding the incident is still being reviewed. As of the latest updates, no comprehensive explanation has been publicly confirmed, and officials have cautioned against drawing conclusions before the investigative process is complete. This distinction is crucial in maintaining an accurate understanding of events as they continue to develop. In moments like these, the internet often moves faster than verified information. But what's notable here is how much of the response has avoided that pattern. Instead of speculation, many voices across the gaming community have shifted toward reflection, asking what Zampella's work changed, why it endured, and how it influenced the direction of modern interactive entertainment. That reflection opens up a larger question. If so much of today's gaming landscape was shaped by decisions made years ago, what does that say about the long-term impact of creative leadership? And how do industries built on constant innovation measure influence when it's spread across decades rather than moments? Because the deeper this story goes, the clearer it becomes that understanding Vince Zampella's significance isn't about isolating a single event. It's about recognizing how quiet, consistent decisions can ripple outward, shaping studios, genres, and player expectations long after the original work is done. As this reflection continues, another layer of the story becomes clearer. Vince Zampella's influence wasn't limited to the games themselves. It extended into how studios were organized, how creative risks were evaluated, and how long-term vision was balanced with commercial pressure. According to people familiar with his work, his leadership style emphasized clarity and restraint rather than constant visibility. This approach mattered in an industry that often rewards loud success. While many high-profile figures became synonymous with marketing campaigns and public appearances, Zampella remained largely focused on internal development and team structure. That choice shaped the environments in which games like Titanfall and Apex Legends were created, spaces where experimentation was encouraged, but always tied back to player experience. From an industry perspective, this kind of leadership had lasting consequences. Analysts have noted that studios influenced by Zampella's methods often prioritized smooth onboarding, readable design, and long-term player retention over short-term novelty. These priorities now appear across a wide range of modern titles, even outside the genres he directly worked in. Against this backdrop, the recent reports take on a different tone. While the circumstances surrounding the incident are still under investigation and key facts remain unconfirmed, the broader conversation has largely avoided speculation. Instead, many discussions have shifted toward understanding how someone with such a low public profile could leave such a large imprint. That shift is telling. It suggests that the story people are trying to understand isn't just about what happened recently, but about how influence is built quietly over time. In creative industries, legacies are rarely defined by a single moment. They are formed through accumulated decisions, mentorship, and a consistent philosophy that outlives individual projects. This perspective also explains why official statements have been careful and measured. By focusing on contribution rather than conjecture, they reinforce the importance of separating verified information from ongoing investigation. As authorities have emphasized, conclusions should only be drawn once all relevant facts are available. For the gaming community, this moment has become a pause rather than a turning point, a chance to reassess how modern gaming arrived at its current form. Many of the systems players now expect, from progression loops to competitive balance, didn't emerge overnight. They were refined through years of iteration, often guided by people whose names weren't always visible to the public. And that brings the story back to a central question. What does lasting influence actually look like in an industry defined by constant change? If the most impactful contributions are sometimes the least visible, how do we recognize them while events are still unfolding? Because the more this story develops, the clearer it becomes that its significance isn't rooted in uncertainty alone. It's rooted in understanding how one individual's approach helped shape an entire generation of games, and why that impact continues to be felt even as details surrounding the present moment remain unresolved.